Dr. Ken Landau. Thanks for watching. Let's talk about Remdesivir. On May 1st, 2020, it received emergency use authorization from the FDA for hospitalized patients with COVID-19 based on top-line data from two studies. One, the NIAID trial, that's from the NIH, Dr. Fauci, and the other one was from Gilead Sciences, that's the manufacturer of the drug. Now, neither were published in medical journals. That's going to come at the end of May, but the Food and Drug Administration says there's enough data now to say that they have a reasonable chance to believe that the known and potential benefits outweigh the known and potential risks for hospitalized patients with severe COVID-19. Now, the scope of the authorization strictly limits the use of the drug. It has to be distributed either to the government or to authorized distributors, and then the government decides where the drug is going to go for adults or children who have either known or suspected COVID-19. Severe disease, meaning the oxygen level in the bloodstream is low. They could be receiving oxygen. The company is not allowed to advertise that this authorization in any way finds that the drug has been found by the Food and Drug Administration to be either safe or effective. They're not allowed to say that it has been approved because it really hasn't been approved. It's authorized, and it's authorized only for the duration of the public health emergency. Now, Dr. Fauci's study, the NIAID study, came out in April 29, and what they found was reason to be optimistic. So it seemed that there was a 31% reduction in the time to clearance. So the people who received the Remdesivir got better after about 11 days versus about 15 days if they received the standard, which was the usual therapy. Well, that's a 31% improvement. The death rate really wasn't statistically significantly different. 8% if you got the drug, 11.6% if you didn't get the drug, short of statistical significance, but it's a proof of concept, it was said. Culture and the rest of the study is going to come out at the end of May, but it's been likened to Tamiflu. Perhaps not a great example because Tamiflu is not a great drug. Well, the NIAID study started off with a patient actually from the quarantine on the Diamond Princess, and then increased significantly. Remdesivir is administered at a dose of 200 milligrams intravenously on the first day, and then 100 milligrams intravenously from days 2 to 10. That was in the NIAID study, and compared to the routine treatment. Well, this was the first study that was launched in the United States. It was for people who had moderately severe disease. They required the oxygen. Started in February 20. The last patient enrolled on April 19. About 1,063 patients altogether, slightly less than 100 sites, both in the United States and in foreign countries. They had planned on April 27 to look at the preliminary data to see if the drug was really working. If the drug was working, then they were going to consider that the standard of care, and instead of the placebo group, add another medicine to try against the Remdesivir to see which of the two was going to be better. Well, it appears that at least under normal circumstances, it would have taken months to years for the FDA to approve the drug. But now, especially since they gave emergency use authorization to hydroxychloroquine, a drug that's much less effective and maybe causes significant side effects, well, they were sort of forced to give the emergency use authorization. So now let's look at the Gilead study. The Gilead study, it was called the SIMPLE trial. That's the name of the trial, SIMPLE trial. And they looked at people who had severe manifestations of the disease, but now they looked at either 5 days or 10 days worth of therapy compared to placebo. And they looked at about 400 people who had severe disease. All of them received 200 milligrams intravenous on day 1. And then the 5-day group received 5 days worth of therapy. The 10-day group received 10 days worth of therapy. And again, we're not going to have the final data until the end of May, but the difference by day 14 showed that the 5-day and the 10-day course seemed to be about the same. Not a significant difference between the two, but it was 20% better, 25% better than the people receiving the placebo. And if we look at the time to improvement for half of the patients, was only about 10 or 11 days with either the 5 or 10 milligram dose. And if we look at the likelihood of being discharged from the hospital by day 14, it was about 60% in the 5-day course and about 54% in the 10-day course. So that's pretty much statistically a wash. And if we look at people who began their treatment before 10 days worth of the illness, more than 60% were able to leave the hospital by day 14 as compared to beginning treatment after the 10th day of symptoms. Then only 50% of the people left the hospital by day 14. And it showed that there were no new safety warnings, so we didn't have any new kind of problems. Now, when they looked at the death rate, it was only about 7% by day 14, looking at the patients not studied in Italy. When they look overall, now at the 397 patients, they find that the deaths by day 14 really were the same whether they were given 5 days or 10 days worth of the medicine, not statistically significantly different. Now, compare all of this to a study that was done in China. The study is marked criticism, but the data should be at least looked at. It was published the same day as the other 2 studies I just mentioned came out. It was prematurely terminated because they couldn't get enough patients. Now, this was done in China. And what they did is they enrolled patients who had fewer than 10 days worth of symptoms. And again, the patients were relatively mildly ill. They weren't severely ill. And they looked at the data and they said that basically we can't draw statistically significant outcomes because we just had too few patients. But looking at the patients, 80% of them received supplemental oxygen, but fewer than 1% received the invasive mechanical ventilation. Now, only about a third of the patients had fever, and if we look at the respiratory rate, it wasn't elevated in a significant number of patients. So the design of the study was they originally wanted about 450 patients, 300 on remdesivir and 150 on placebo, but they couldn't get more than 230 patients. So there were about 150 patients, 160 patients on remdesivir, and 80 patients on the placebo. Patients, again, were not severe. And what they found was that the drug wasn't a cure-all, and indeed, the patients didn't immediately get rid of the symptoms when they were treated, and as a matter of fact, there's a point after which the remdesivir doesn't seem to work, and maybe it doesn't seem to work in patients whose disease isn't really from the virus anymore, but now it's the body's immune system that's taking over. Well, they looked at clinical improvement by day 7. And they found it was the same whether the patients received remdesivir or placebo at 3%. They looked at day 14 and about a quarter of the patients got better, again, irrespective of whether they received the remdesivir or the placebo. But they did find that if the treatment was begun soon after the patients had symptoms, within the first 10 days, well, then the improvement was more marked on the remdesivir patients. Day 18, they were significantly improved, versus day 23, significantly improved if they were receiving the standard kind of therapy. And if you look at the mortality between the remdesivir and the placebo didn't make any difference. They were both about 13, 14%. And if you look at all of the other statistics, basically they don't show any significant difference between the remdesivir group and the placebo group. Now, the drug itself, patented in 2014, 2015, Gilead Sciences. It was originally designed to treat Ebola and Marburg and the Cueva virus. But even though they started researching the drug as early as 2009 and then getting some more information, 2013, 2014, that it was a broad antiviral drug, began some investigational new drug therapy just to test whether it was going to be safe and effective and what the pharmacokinetics were. That was started as early as July of 2015. And then you have to realize this is at a time when they're having a major Ebola outbreak in Africa. So the Centers for Disease Control, looking for any kind of a drug, and they were talking to the folks at Gilead. They started looking through a series of medicines that they had that weren't used for anything special, just drugs that were sort of warehoused. And they found one that they called GS 5734. That's what we now call Remdesivir. And they found that it might have significant value. So they handed it off to the U.S. Army Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, and they did some further research, and they found at least that in rhesus monkeys, the drug blocked the replication of Ebola virus. Now, the drug itself, Remdesivir, it's a prodrug. It's not active by itself. It has to be converted. First, it's converted by some esterases in the body. Phosphate group is added, a couple more reactions, another couple phosphates. So ultimately, it's a triphosphate drug. During this time, having this major epidemic in Africa, as a matter of fact, the World Health Organization said the Ebola outbreak was a public health emergency of immediate concern. Well, the first patient to receive the Remdesivir happened to be a Scottish nurse. She developed Ebola in late 2014, went through several different treatments, finally seemed to get better in January of 2015 when the serum of another nurse who previously had Ebola was administered to her. She did well, but unfortunately she started developing symptoms of meningoencephalitis in mid to late 2015. They found the Ebola virus still in her blood and spinal fluid. So she was treated with Remdesivir, and she was treated successfully in a 14-day course. Well, during the same whole period of time, the NIAID, Dr. Fauci and his group, they're investigating all sorts of drugs, and since they found with the CDC and the Army that the drug might have benefit against some of the coronaviruses, and since we're getting to be in a MERS outbreak, the drug was handed off to the University of Alabama at Birmingham at what they call the Antiviral Drug Discovery and Development Center, AD3C. And what they did is they, through a group of other universities, were investigating a series of drugs that might be relevant to certain kind of viral illnesses. And since it's coronavirus, the centers that were studying coronavirus happened to be University of North Carolina and Vanderbilt University. The drug was sent there. And at the same time now, we have the MERS that's occurring in Saudi Arabia, and the World Health Organization placed it on the list of emerging diseases likely to be major epidemics. So the NIAID is studying the drug. They actually looked at the Rocky Mountain laboratories in Montana. What would happen if you gave some of the macaque monkeys prophylactic therapy with Remdesivir and then infected them with the MERS virus? Well, actually, nothing happened. The animals did extremely well. Well, what would happen if you give the animals the MERS virus and then begin treatment about 12 hours later? Well, clear benefits, no question about it, clear benefits. But there was virus that replicated in the lung, and there were lung lesions. And at the same time, they were doing some mouse studies, and they found that they could block the virus in the mouse. And they found that it worked pretty well. Now, if the animals were inoculated, and then after a short period of time, day one, they were given the Remdesivir, did extraordinarily well. Did okay, but not quite as well if the medicine was delayed for 2 days. Well, at the same time, going back to Africa, we still have this new Ebola outbreak, and it started in 2018 and is going on. Well, the World Health Organization, kind of stung by the previous outbreak of Ebola in Africa, and there's sort of a scattershot approach to it. So they organized a trial, and they looked at 4 different drugs. Remdesivir was one, and the other 3 were monoclonal antibodies. One of them was made through the NIH on a patient that had healed from the Ebola back in 1995. The other one was from Regeneron, and then there was a third one called ZMapp that was a combination of chemicals. And what they did is they looked at these drugs, and they found, they went to study 700 patients, and they found that the overall fatality rate, no treatment, 75+%, remdesivir, about half of the people died. But if they were given the Regeneron medicine or the antibodies, the monoclonal antibodies that were developed at the NIAID, only about 30% of the patients died. So 30% with the monoclonal antibodies, 50% with the remdesivir, 75+% no treatment. If they look at low viral load, only about 6 to 10% of the people died if they received those monoclonal antibodies, either the NIH origination or the Regeneron. If they received the remdesivir, still about 33% of the patients died. So looking at that kind of data, the health authorities from the Democratic Republic of Congo and the World Health Organization, they said, stop the study. And let's just use the other medicines that seem to work, and we won't use the remdesivir. Well, that was kind of fortunate because that was in August of 2019, which meant that the company, Gilead, had a significant amount of stock on hand, just as we're going to get into the coronavirus epidemic. So in January of 2020, when the Chinese investigators published the gene sequence an RNA of the coronavirus, the COVID-19, the investigators at the Gilead said, hey, it looks like it's the same polymerase gene, looks like it's identical to what we found in the SARS virus. So all of a sudden now, the World Health Organization is listing COVID-19 as a public health emergency of international concern, and the company is starting studies on the drug, starting studies here in the United States, in China, and other countries. They found in some cell culture examinations, looking at the African green monkey kidney epithelial cells, that the drug seemed to work very well to stop the viral growth. But then it was also found that chloroquine seemed to work at least fairly well too. Now, the Chinese investigators looking at the drug, they say it has phenomenal effect. At the Wuhan Viral Research Unit, phenomenal effect. And it seems that remdesivir actually can stop a lot of viruses from replicating. So the SARS and the MERS and, of course, the COVID-19, but also other related coronaviruses like the feline infectious peritonitis virus. And then it seemed to be helpful for Ebola and RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, and influenza, and some of the bad viruses in Africa, like the Marburg virus and the Hendra virus and the Nipah virus. So it seems that these viruses, a lot of viruses, not just the coronaviruses, replicate by manufacturing an enzyme from its genetic sequence on a polymerase gene. And the polymerase gene makes this thing called the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. And what that does is it puts the amino acids onto the ever-elongating chain. But the remdesivir acts as a decoy, and what it does is it's inserted instead of the adenine, or adenosine triphosphate. And what happens is that the virus that normally has a proofreader, we call it an exoribonuclease, that normally notices faults and gets rid of them so the virus can keep dividing or keep manufacturing its RNA gene, it just fools that too. So then after the remdesivir is added, and the remdesivir goes through several stages, of course, well, after the remdesivir is added, 3 more nucleotides are put on and everything comes to a complete stop. Well, that sounds like it's pretty good, but how does that affect patients? First patient in the United States was a 35-year-old man who returned from China, returned on January 15th of this year. He developed a dry cough. He felt a little feverish. He went to the urgent care facilities in Snohomish, Washington. They ultimately found that he was infected with the coronavirus. He was hospitalized. He was doing pretty well until he developed pneumonia on the 5th day, and then he seemed to go downhill on the 7th day, received the Remdesivir compassionate use. On the 7th day, 8th day was feeling great. Seemed to do quite well. There was a series of patients in the United States that were treated in January. Several of them received the Remdesivir. The patient I just mentioned was one of them. There were 2 others that seemed to all of a sudden do poorly on the 11th day of their illness, and the patients received the treatment for 4 days, 5 days, or 10 days, seemed to do quite well. Then we had a study in the New England Journal that came out in April 10 of 2020. It was an open label study worldwide from compassionate use medicine donated by Gilead. Patients were supposed to receive 10 days worth of the dose. They received that initial 200 milligrams, and that was followed by 100 milligrams intravenously every day for 9 days. They received the standard care wherever in the world they happened to be. 45% were in the US and Canada, 45% were in Europe, 10% were in Japan. These patients were relatively severely affected. About 2/3 of them were receiving invasive ventilation, in other words, the mechanical ventilation. They had their symptoms on average for about 12 days before the therapy began. 3/4 of them did indeed receive the 10 days worth of therapy. On an average of 18 days of follow-up, well, it was found that 2/3 of the patients improved at least as far as the level of oxygen that they were receiving, level of oxygen support, and about 60% of the people on mechanical ventilators were able to be extubated. Only 13% of the people died. That's 5% of the people not receiving invasive ventilation, and 18% of the people receiving the mechanical ventilation. So basically, if you were just receiving room air or low flow oxygen, 100% improvement, and even among the people who were receiving the high flow but non-invasive mechanical ventilation, 70% of the patients improved, and among the patients receiving the invasive mechanical ventilation, about 60% improved. So it looks like the drug offers some significant benefit. Now, if you happen to be more than 70 years old, according to the study, didn't do quite as well as if you were less than 70 years of age. And certainly the people who were receiving the mechanical ventilation didn't do quite as well as the people who weren't. Well, side effects, nothing really meaningful. So the study was designed by Gilead, and the lead author, doctor from Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles, said that we can't draw definitive conclusions because it was an open study and there was really no placebo group. But he said that it was hopeful. Other doctors said it was encouraging. But it seems the time to begin therapy is very important. The sooner the better. You have to receive the treatment before the immune system takes over. So you go from healthy to having the virus. You're incubating the virus, you don't have any symptoms. Now the virus starts to grow to a significant level and you develop symptoms. Those are caused by the virus. But the immune system fighting the virus now becomes overwhelming. And the reason many of the people die is because of the immune system hyperreactivity. Now, because the drug seemed to work, Gilead had what's known as a compassionate use. If there was a reason to get the drug, your doctor would submit a request to Gilead. That started in January 25. They would look at the request and they would donate the medicine. Well, they didn't really expect a lot of patients, but there was a surge in requests and it really overwhelmed them. So on March 23, they said, we're going to stop this, but instead, we're going to have an expanded access. So we're going to get some centers here in the United States, and the European Medicines Agency did basically the same thing in Europe. Here in the United States, they had 22 centers in the United States, and these centers were able to provide the medicine to larger numbers of patients. Well, the company is ramping up the production of the medicine, obviously, and they want to make sure that they have enough on hand because they were originally treating Ebola, and that doesn't really require a lot of medicine. So they had about enough for 5,000 patients in January. They weren't manufacturing it on a regular basis. But since January of 2020, they've ramped up production so that they now have enough, depending on whether it's a 5-day or a 10-day course, for anywhere between about 140,000 patients and 250,000 patients. By the end of the year, they expect to have enough on hand to treat at least 1 million patients, and that's assuming a 10-day course. Now, a 5-day course seems to be just as good, and now what they're trying to do is they're trying to manufacture, trying to develop the drug so that it might be able to be used either as a nasal spray or taken orally, so you won't require hospitalization and won't have to be intravenous. Well, the company got their patent, as I said, in 2015 and several modifications later. Now, the only hitch in the whole thing came in March of 2020 when they applied for and received something known as orphan drug status. Orphan drug status, when fewer than 200,000 people are going to have whatever the disease is, you get special tax advantages, and you get a 7-year patent exclusivity so that nobody else can compete with you. Well, it just so happened that one of the members of the coronavirus task force happened to be a former Gilead executive, and there were some other issues, moral outrage by public citizen, by Bernie Sanders, and then ultimately the company said, you know, we're 2 days after they received the orphan status, they said, we're not going to accept it, we don't need it. So everything was okay. Then all of a sudden, some Chinese researchers from Wuhan wanted to challenge the patent in China and say, well, they got the idea to treat the COVID-19 with the remdesivir. Didn't happen. How much is all of this going to cost? Well, if we look at the cost of the drugs that are currently made by Gilead, they're pretty expensive. So Harvoni, a month worth of hepatitis C treatment, $15,000, Epclusa, $10,000. Some of their HIV medicine, like Biktarvy or Truvada, anywhere between $2,200 and $3,600. That's cash, non-discounted cost. But the company's been very nice. What the company says is they're going to donate all of the stock that they have on hand, going to donate it to the federal government. That's about 1.5 million doses. That's enough for somewhere between 140,000 and 250,000 patients, depending on the length of therapy, 5-day, 10-day. How much is it going to cost after that? Well, the thought is that they could make $1 billion profit if it was $1,000, but the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, a group out of Boston, it's conservative company, conservative think tank, they say that, you know, it would still be cost effective even if it were priced at about $4,500 a therapy. Well, just an interesting note on the drug, it was found because they were investigating it in China, it might also prevent non-alcoholic fatty liver. So that comes just out of nowhere. Anyway, that's the story about remdesivir. It's not a home run by any means, but it's sort of a bridge between where we are now without any kind of therapy until we get to a point where we have the vaccine. And that's going to be many more months. And at least at the present time, the forecasts show that between now and then, the disease may well cause a heck of a lot more problems. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'm Dr. Ken Landau. If you enjoyed the show, please tell a friend and subscribe so that you'll be notified when we post new videos. Appreciate your interest. I'm Dr. Ken Landau.